So more than half of the antibiotics produced in the United States are used in food animal production, which is leading to antibiotic-resistant bacteria. In the United States alone, 40 billion pounds of fertilizer are poured onto the land each year. According to the EPA, between 800 and 900 million pounds of pesticides are poured onto the U.S. lands. And according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, an estimated 67 million birds are killed by pesticides each year. And all of this is just in the United States. There are countless more millions of pounds of pesticides and fertilizers used throughout the world, and millions more animals are killed each year because of them. According to the National Academy of Sciences, 80% of the pesticides used in the United States are potentially carcinogenic, and between 4 and 20,000 cases of cancer are caused each year by pesticides in quantities deemed acceptable by the EPA. Other pesticides are linked to neurological issues such as impaired memory, lower IQ, and ADHD in children. Pesticide advocates assert that these chemicals have been tested for negative health effects and are deemed safe by the EPA after scientific research. But while this may be true in some cases, the synergistic effects of these chemicals when they're used in combination are almost never tested. And one conventional farmer only uses one type of pesticide. There's one to keep away the aphids, one to reduce the weeds, one to ward off diseases like the blight. And when we put all of these on the same plant, we now have several doses of pesticides of all different chemicals that are supposedly deemed safe by the EPA individually, but in combination have never been tested, and most likely have an effect that is orders of magnitude larger than when used individually. And what about the people who work on these farms? The EPA safety standards apply to the final product in the supermarket, but farm workers are exposed to concentrations much higher than those found in the final product. So I'm going to show a short 3.5-minute video that does a pretty good job of introducing the meat industry, and hopefully most of you have seen The Matrix. If not, it won't be quite as funny because it's a bit of a spoof on The Matrix, but if you haven't seen the movie, you'll still understand everything they're talking about.
Any chance we can lower the lights?
Yeah.
What? Lower the lights. Oh, yeah.
Leo, who are you? And how did you know my name? I am Moonface, and I know a lot about you. Have you heard of the Matrix? The Matrix? Do you want to know what it is? Okay. The Matrix is all around you. It is the story we tell ourselves about where meat and animal products come from. This family farm is a fantasy. Take the blue pill and stay here in the fantasy. Take the red pill and I'll show you the truth. Every day we get closer to an epidemic that cannot be stopped. high levels of related sicknesses. Well, it smells like shh. And what's more, factory farm corporations have been destroying communities and mistreating their workers for decades. Since 1950, over 2 million small-lot farms have disappeared. If they continue at this rate, there'll be no real independent family farms left. That is the matrix, Leo. The lie we tell ourselves about where our food comes from. But it's not too late. There is a resistance. Count me in! So how do we stop the movement? We are going to spread the word. When it's you, the consumer, who has the real power. Don't support the factory farm. There's a world of alternatives. And I'll show you what you can do to escape
So the matrix focuses on the meat industry, and in addition to what was explained in the video, factory farms are also contributing greatly to the issue of climate change. There is no debating that climate around the world is changing, and greenhouse gases are contributing to an increase in global temperatures. Greenhouse gases trap heat from the earth in the atmosphere and radiate it back to the planet, thus increasing the temperatures. The more greenhouse gases, the more heat absorption, the more warming. Manure from factory farms produces a huge amount of methane, which is a greenhouse gas that, mass for mass, has a power 20 times greater in warming than carbon dioxide in a 100-year period. And when manure decomposes naturally on grassland, it decomposes aerobically with oxygen and creates very little methane emissions. But when manure is stored as a liquid or a slurry in ponds or tanks or even just on the ground, which is the case for nearly all factory farms, the manure decomposes anaerobically without oxygen and creates much more methane than when it decomposes aerobically. About 85% of all of the methane emissions in the U.S. come from dairy cattle and swine. 85%. According to the EPA, agriculture alone accounts for about 8% of all greenhouse gases emissions in the U.S. And this seems a little high, but maybe almost reasonable considering everybody has to eat, until you realize that this figure doesn't take into account any of the transportation of the food from producer to the consumer. So the average piece of produce travels about 1,500 miles in a semi-truck from farm to the store. But that's just for produce. When you talk about processed or packaged foods, you have an average of 1,500 miles for each ingredient to get to the packaging plant, and then another 1,500 miles to get to the store. So if you have a bag of mixed vegetables that has, say, 4 vegetables in it, that's 1,500 miles times 4 ingredients to get to the packaging plant, plus another 1,500 miles to get from the packaging plant to the store. And that's a total of 7,500 miles. I think that you'll all agree with me that it's pretty absurd to be buying things that travel so far when we can grow a lot of them right here. Sure, we can't grow oranges or bananas in Colorado, but we can grow onions, garlic, potatoes, apples, spinach, squash, peppers, and a whole lot more. Of the nearly $300 billion in subsidies distributed in the last 17 years, well below half of the farms in the U.S. collected any subsidy payments at all. And 75% of this subsidy money went to the top 10% of large-scale farms. So what's wrong with this? Big ag farms that drown their crops in pesticides, drown the soils in fertilizers because the monocropping practices deplete the soils of the nutrients, can sell their crops at a price below the cost of production. They sell their crops for less than they paid to grow them. And people complain that organic produce is expensive. Well, how could it not be considered expensive when they have to cost more than conventionally grown produce for the simple reason that organic farmers have to cover their costs of production? The organic farm isn't getting subsidized like the large one is. And it's internalizing the costs of production that are externalized and largely ignored by the large-scale agriculture and getting nothing for it, while the government pays the big ag to externalize their costs, to pollute, to exploit. I know I'm painting a pretty bleak picture right now, but this is the situation that we're in, and the only way out is to change our buying habits. Like Michael Pollan says, we vote 3 times a day with our fork, and this is where active citizenship fits in. using our rights to vote, to spend money, to speak, and to act, and using them in a responsible way, voting responsibly, spending money responsibly, speaking responsibly, and acting responsibly. Active citizenship is the organic movement. It's the local movement. It's all of the movements that include people utilizing their individual power to combat these conventional farming practices and to promote locally and sustainably grown food. This is active citizenship. And I consider myself part of this movement and part of these active citizens.